Number 25. In this game, the stakes were all too real. I was always a fan of horror games, the adrenaline rush of being chased by monsters, the thrill of solving puzzles and uncovering dark secrets. It was all part of the appeal. But when I heard about a new game called The Abyss, I knew that this was something different. The rumors were wild. People claimed that the game was so immersive that it felt like you were really there, that the dangers were all too real. I brushed it off as just another urban legend, but my curiosity got the better of me. I downloaded the game and started playing. At first, everything seemed normal. The graphics were stunning, the puzzles challenging but not impossible. But then, as I progressed through the levels, I started to notice something off. The monsters were more aggressive, their attacks leaving me feeling like I had really been hurt. The puzzles became more twisted, their solutions leading me down a rabbit hole of darkness and despair. And then there were the glitches. Strange things would happen. Objects would move on their own. The game would freeze and then restart on its own. It was like the game was alive and it was toying with me. I tried to quit the game, but I couldn't. The program had taken over my computer, and no matter what I did, I couldn't shut it off. As I played, the stakes grew higher. I knew that I was risking more than just my virtual life. The dangers were all too real. But I couldn't stop playing. The game had taken hold of me, and I was just a pawn in its twisted game. In the end, I don't know what happened. I don't remember how I got out of the game, or what happened to me while I was trapped inside. But I know one thing for sure. I'll never play another horror game again. The dangers are just too real. Number 26. Into the Unknown. It started innocently enough. A group of friends gathered around a table playing a board game that promised to be the ultimate horror experience. But as we played, things began to get strange. The game seemed to take on a life of its own, the pieces moving on their own, the board changing in ways that shouldn't have been possible. We laughed it off at first, thinking that it was just a glitch in the game. But as the night wore on, the laughter turned to fear. We realized that we were no longer in control. The game was. The rules became more and more complicated, and the stakes grew higher. We found ourselves drawn into a world of darkness and terror, a place where the monsters were all too real and the consequences of failure were deadly. We fought our way through level after level, each one more terrifying than the last. But the game always seemed to be one step ahead, anticipating our every move and plotting our demise. And then, just when we thought it was over, the final level began. It was a battle to the death, a fight for survival against an enemy that was more powerful than anything we had ever faced before. In the end, we emerged victorious, but at a terrible cost. The game had changed us, twisted us into something that we no longer recognized. And as we packed up the board and put it away, we knew that we could never play that game again. For in that game, the stakes were higher than we could ever have imagined. It was a world of darkness and terror, a place where the only way to win was to survive. If you could. Number 27. Nightmare's Edge. I was always a fan of horror games. There was something about the tension, the jump scares, and the immersive worlds that drew me in, even as they made my heart race. But one game in particular stood out to me, a game that promised an experience like no other. It was called Nightmare's Edge, and it was said to be the most terrifying game ever made. I didn't believe the hype at first. I mean, I had played my fair share of horror games. But from the moment I started Nightmare's Edge, I knew that this was something different. The graphics were incredible, the sound design was immersive, and the atmosphere was oppressive. I found myself getting lost in the world of the game, forgetting that it was just a digital creation. But as I played, I started to notice something strange. The game seemed to be learning, adapting to my actions, and becoming more and more unpredictable. And then I started to see things, shadows moving in the corners of my vision, whispers that seemed to come from the screen itself. I tried to brush it off, telling myself that it was just my imagination. But as I delved deeper into the game, I realized that something was seriously wrong. The line between the game and reality was blurring, and I was starting to lose my grip on what was real. And so I found myself trapped, my mind and body held captive by a game that had become all too real. As I struggled to survive in its twisted world, I realized that sometimes the things we create can take on a life of their own, and that the line between fantasy and reality can blur all too easily. Number 28. The Nightmare Game. I had always been a fan of horror games. The thrill of being scared, of exploring creepy environments and facing off against terrifying monsters. It was a rush like no other, but the game I found myself playing now was different. It was called the Nightmare Game, and it promised to be the scariest game of all time. I started playing, expecting the usual jump scares and eerie atmospheres. But as I progressed through the levels, I began to realize that something was wrong. The game seemed to be adapting to my fears, creating scenarios that were tailored to my specific phobias. I tried to quit the game, but it wouldn't let me. It was like I was trapped inside of it, unable to escape. As I continued to play, the horror grew more intense. The monsters were no longer just pixels on a screen. They felt real, like they were right there in the room with me. The fear was all-consuming, and I felt myself slipping into a state of panic. And then I saw something that made my blood run cold. The character in the game turned to face me, and I realized with a sickening feeling that it wasn't just a game anymore. It was something far more sinister, something that had reached out from the digital world and into my own reality. I don't remember much after that. The fear was too intense, and my mind couldn't handle it. But I do know that I never played another horror game again. The nightmare that was the Nightmare Game had scarred me for life, and I knew that I could never face that kind of horror again. Number 29. Be careful what games you play, for they may play you back. I had always been a fan of horror games. There was something thrilling about the feeling of being chased by monsters, of exploring haunted houses and uncovering the secrets within. So when I heard about a new game that promised to be the scariest thing on the market, I was intrigued. It was called The Endless Maze, and the premise was simple. Navigate your way through a maze filled with horrors, and make it to the end alive. But as I started playing, I realized that this game was different. The graphics were more realistic, the sounds more immersive, and the creatures that lurked within the maze seemed almost too real. As I played, I felt myself becoming more and more immersed in the game world. The fear that I had felt at the beginning of the game had become a constant companion, following me even when I wasn't playing. And then one night, I realized that something was wrong. The game seemed to be following me, invading my dreams and my waking thoughts. The monsters that I had faced within the game seemed to be lurking in the shadows of my own bedroom. I tried to stop playing the game, but I found that I couldn't. It was as if the game had become a part of me, a virus that had infected my very being. And then one night, as I was playing the game in a state of near panic, I found myself face to face with the final boss, a creature so terrifying that I felt my mind begin to unravel. But as I fought for my life within the game, I realized that I was also fighting for my life outside of it. The game had become a trap, a labyrinth that I couldn't escape from. In the end, I managed to defeat the final boss and make my way to the end of the maze. But as I looked up from the screen, I knew that I had been changed forever. The game had become a part of me, and I could never truly escape its grasp. Number 30. Beta Tester. I was always a fan of horror games. The rush of fear and adrenaline as I navigated my way through dark corridors and creepy landscapes. But one game in particular stands out in my memory as something truly terrifying. It was a game that promised an immersive experience, one where the player was transported into a virtual world of terror. And from the moment I put on the headset and stepped into that world, I knew that I was in for something different. The graphics were stunningly realistic, the sound effects so convincing that I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I felt as if I was truly there, walking through the desolate landscape, trying to avoid the monsters that lurked in the shadows. But as the game went on, something began to feel off. The monsters seemed too real, their movements too fluid and lifelike. And then, I began to notice something even more unsettling. The environment around me was changing. At first, it was subtle. A door that had been closed was now open. A hallway that had been straight now twisted and turned. But as I progressed through the game, the changes grew more pronounced, more terrifying. It was as if the game itself was alive, adapting to my every move, anticipating my every fear. And as the monsters grew more aggressive, more relentless, I found myself losing track of what was real and what was part of the game. By the time I finally reached the end, I was a quivering mess, my nerves shattered and my senses on high alert. I took off the headset, gasping for breath, feeling as if I had just emerged from a nightmare. But as I looked around my room, I realized that the line between the game and reality had become blurred. The monsters were still there, lurking in the shadows, and I couldn't shake the feeling that they were waiting for me even now. Number 31. Morphed. I always loved horror games. There was something exhilarating about the sense of danger and dread, the rush of adrenaline as I navigated my way through a world filled with monsters and ghosts. But one day, that love turned to terror. I was playing a new game, one that promised to be the scariest yet. As I played, I felt myself being drawn deeper and deeper into the game world, the lines between reality and the digital realm blurring, until I wasn't sure where one ended and the other began. The monsters in the game seemed to take on a life of their own, their twisted forms leaping out of the screen and into my room. I felt their hot breath on my neck, heard their rasping breaths in my ear. I tried to pause the game, to turn it off, and escape the horror that had taken over my reality. But the controls wouldn't respond, as if the game had a life of its own and was determined to keep me trapped within its twisted world. As the terror mounted, I realized that I was no longer just playing a game. I was living a nightmare. I tried to scream, to call for help, but my voice was drowned out by the sound of my racing heart and the screams of the monsters that had come to life around me. Finally, just as I thought I would be consumed by the horror, the game suddenly shut down. I was left alone in the quiet of my room, the only sound the pounding of my heart and the ragged gasps of my breath. I knew then that I could never look at horror games in the same way again. The line between reality and the game world was too thin, too easily crossed, and I knew that I would always be looking over my shoulder, wondering if the next game would be the one that would consume me completely. Number 32. Sometimes the game can play you. I had always loved horror games. There was something about the tension and suspense that drew me in, the way my heart would race as I tried to make my way through dark and dangerous worlds. But one game in particular stood out to me. It was an old arcade game that had been gathering dust in the corner of the local gaming store for years. The cabinet was covered in scratches and dents, the paint peeling away in places, but something about it called to me. I inserted a few coins and began to play. The game was simple at first, just a maze that I had to navigate my way through, avoiding monsters and collecting treasures along the way. But as I progressed, the game began to change. The monsters grew more aggressive, the traps more deadly. And then I noticed something strange. The game seemed to be responding to my actions as if it was alive and aware of what I was doing. At first, I dismissed it as a glitch, a quirk of the game's programming. But as the game continued, it became clear that something was very wrong. The monsters began to taunt me, speaking in voices that sounded like they were coming from inside my head. And when I died, the game didn't reset. It continued on, as if waiting for me to try again. I tried to walk away from the game, to leave it behind and forget about what had happened. But I couldn't. It was like a magnet drawing me back in, enticing me with its dark and twisted world. And then, one day, I realized the truth. The game wasn't just a game. It was something more, something that had taken on a life of its own. And as I played, I was no longer the one in control. I was simply a pawn in its twisted game. I don't know what will happen to me now that I've realized the truth about the game. But one thing is certain, I'll never look at horror games the same way again.